The Bride Who Won. In the winter of 1571, when Moscow lay under a sky the color of old iron, the bells of the Kremlin rang not for warning but for celebration, announcing a marriage that the realm had been taught to fear and revere in equal measure, because the groom was Ivan the Terrible, sovereign by divine claim and terror by daily proof, and the bride was Marfa Vasilevna Sobakina, 19 years old, chosen from more than 2,000 young women in the greatest bride show Russia had ever assembled, a ritual that trusts coercion as honor and turned daughters into offerings, delivered from every province by families who understood that refusal could be fatal and acceptance could be worse. For weeks she had been measured, inspected, questioned, watched, tested for strength and pliability as though she were a vessel rather than a person, her body reduced to numbers, her history sifted for impurities, her emotions provoked and judged, until the final chamber opened and Ivan himself walked among the remaining candidates with a predator's patience, asking questions without answers, smiling at fear, lingering where anxiety surfaced, and when his finger stopped, when her name was spoken, the court applauded as if fortune had been bestowed instead of a sentence quietly pronounced. The wedding glittered with gold and incense, priests chanting blessings that echoed off marble, while courtiers bowed and smiled, and Marfa learned the first law of survival in Ivan's orbit, which was that joy must never be trusted because joy attracted scrutiny, and scrutiny invited correction. 12 days passed as Tsarina of all Russia, 12 days of carefully rationed appearances, and whispers that followed her through corridors like draughts of cold air. 12 days in which she felt her strength ebb without cause her appetite falter, her hands tremble at dawn, while physicians murmured and offered tonics that tasted of metal and secrecy. Then, without proclamation or farewell, the doors that had once opened for her began to close. The servants who answered her questions were replaced by others who answered only to the Tsar, and the language of court shifted from celebration to concern, from concern to suspicion, until the suspicion hardened into certainty, because certainty was what Ivan required. Below the holy walls of the Alexandrov Kremlin lay a chamber that did not exist in records, a place of stone and shadow, where incense mixed with iron and something organic that caught the throat. And it was here that Marfa was brought under cover of night, chained to the wall, not as a queen, but as a problem to be solved, while men in black robes stood apart and murmured prayers that sounded less like worship than instruction. Ivan watched from the darkness with a fascination that mistook suffering for revelation, convinced that sickness meant conspiracy, and that truth would surface if pain were applied with care. She denied what she did not know, swore oaths she believed would matter, and wondered how a wedding could end here so quickly, not yet understanding that the bride show had never been about marriage at all, but about selection, testing, and disposal, and that her victory had merely placed her closer to a system that required a sacrifice to justify its own appetite. As the chanting grew louder and the instruments were warmed, the lesson of Ivan's Russia became clear, though too late to save her, that power did not seek love or loyalty, only proof, and proof was always extracted where no witnesses could speak. The chamber that officially doesn't exist, the chamber beneath the Alexandrov Kremlin, was designed for one purpose, only to remove doubt from the Tsar's mind. And doubt was something Ivan the Terrible considered more dangerous than any foreign army, because doubt suggested that power might be, questioned, and questions once allowed to breathe could grow into resistance. Marfa learned this as the days blurred together, measured not by sunlight, but by pain and exhaustion, by the tightening of chains and the rhythm of prayers whispered by men who were not monks in the holy sense, but members of the Oproshniki, Ivan's private order, bound by oaths that replaced conscience with obedience and turned faith into a tool sharpened for interrogation. They told her that God demanded truth, that sickness was never accidental, that poison always came from a human hand guided by malice, and if she was dying then someone wished the Tsar, dead through her a logic so perfectly circular that innocence itself became proof of guilt. Ivan did not rage or shout in this place. because rage suggested loss of control, and control was the one thing he never surrendered. Instead, he spoke softly, asking the same questions in different forms, circling like a scholar around a difficult text, watching how fear altered her answers, how fatigue reshaped her voice, how desperation might loosen a confession from nothing. Physicians were brought in not to heal, but to observe, to note how her body reacted to mixtures slipped into her food, tiny doses administered carefully to provoke weakness without immediate death, because Even believed the body would betray secrets the mind tried to hide. Each morning she woke weaker, her vision clouded, her thoughts slowed, while the court above whispered that the young Tsarina was frail, perhaps cursed, perhaps touched by witchcraft, and in Russia, witchcraft was a crime that could justify anything. What made the chamber truly unbearable was not the instruments laid out in deliberate view, or the threat of pain that hovered like a held breath, but the certainty that no appeal existed beyond these walls, because the law stopped where Even's will began, and even God was interpreted through his mouth. Marfa pleaded not for mercy, but for understanding, insisting there was no plot, no poisoner, no enemy hidden in her blood, and each denial tightened the neck, because Even needed a narrative that explained his fear, and narratives required villains. Above ground, officials prepared lists. Families were quietly placed under observation. Servants interrogated, and the machinery of accusation began to turn. All because one young woman's body was failing in a way that could not be allowed to remain unexplained. In this system, suffering was not a byproduct, but a method, because pain created urgency, urgency created mistakes, and mistakes created confessions, whether true or manufactured, and if none appeared, the absence itself could be declared evidence of an enemy clever enough to hide. As the days passed, Marfa understood with growing clarity that survival was never the goal of this process, because survival would mean uncertainty remained, and uncertainty was intolerable to a ruler who demanded absolute clarity at any cost. Somewhere in the shadows, Avon watched with the calm interest of a man conducting an experiment he had performed before and would perform again, already imagining how her death, when it came, would be transformed into justification, how blame would be assigned, and how fear, once renewed, would ripple outward through the court, reminding everyone that proximity to power was not protection, but exposure. The machine behind the monster, what was happening to Marfa, was not an aberration, nor the sudden cruelty of a volatile ruler, but the visible edge of a system that even the terrible had spent years perfecting, a system that turned fear into governance and intimacy into surveillance, ensuring that no one who came close to him remained whole for long. Long before Marfa's chains cut into her wrists, Evan had learned that absolute power was easiest to maintain when it operated invisibly, when punishment appeared inevitable rather than ordered, and when victims could not identify the moment they crossed from safety into condemnation. This machine did not rely on constant violence, because constant violence dulled its own effect. Instead, it relied on uncertainty, on the slow erosion of certainty that made obedience feel like the only stable ground. The first component of the system was isolation, executed with bureaucratic precision. Every woman drawn into Ivan's inner circle was separated from her past in stages that felt reasonable at first: a reduction in visits for security, a change of servants for efficiency, a temporary move for prayer or recovery, until one day she realized that every voice around her reported to the Tsar, and that every letter she wrote passed through hands trained to read for treason. The second component was unpredictability, because predictable cruelty could be planned for, but unpredictability shattered resolve. A woman might be praised publicly and humiliated privately, rewarded lavishly and punished for gratitude, forgiven one day and accused the next, never knowing which version of Ivan she would encounter, or which expression on her face might be misread as defiance. The third component was narrative control, the careful shaping of stories that explained suffering in ways that protected the system itself. Illness became witchcraft, fear became guilt, resistance became evidence of conspiracy, and the absence of proof became proof of cunning. Once a narrative was declared, it spread faster than truth, because it carried the weight of authority, and those who repeated it did so not out of belief, but out of survival. The fourth component was ritual, the deliberate blending of religion and punishment that made obedience feel sacred and suffering feel ordained. Prayers accompanied interrogations, blessings framed accusations, and priests stood beside enforcers, ensuring that the boundary between faith and fear dissolved until submission felt like piety. Marfa's body was failing within this architecture, not because it was weak, but because the system required her to fail in order to function. Her sickness validated Ivan's suspicions, justified the scrutiny of noble families, and provided the moral fuel for purges that would follow, because terror was most effective when it appeared reactive rather than planned. In this way, the system fed on itself, each victim reinforcing the logic that created the next, until cruelty became routine and mercy seemed reckless. What made escape impossible was that the machine did not announce itself. It revealed itself only after it had closed every exit. By the time a woman understood the rules had already been rewritten around her, and compliance no longer guaranteed safety, only delay. Somewhere above the chamber, scribes prepared chronicles that would soften these realities into vague phrases. Illness, exile, misfortune, preserving the image of a ruler troubled but necessary, while the truth remained buried in fragments and whispers. And as Marfa weakened, the machine adjusted, preparing to convert her death into meaning, because meaning, not humanity, was the currency of Evan's reign. And once meaning was secured, another sacrifice could be selected, polished, and presented as destiny. The brides who never lasted, by the time Marfa's strength ebbed to a whisper, the court already knew how this story usually ended, because her suffering fit a pattern that had been repeating for years, a pattern etched into memory and rumor, even when chronicles tried to smooth it away. Even the terrible had taken wives before, and each union had begun with ceremony and blessing and ended with silence. Exile or death, outcomes explained publicly as illness, divine judgment, or political necessity, while privately understood as inevitability. Servants spoke in half-sentences, officials avoided names, and noble families learned to celebrate marriages with restraint, because enthusiasm suggested hope, and hope attracted attention. The first wives were remembered as tragedies, individual misfortunes that could be blamed on fate or frailty, but as the years passed and the endings accumulated, the tragedies merged into something more disturbing, a rhythm that suggested design rather than chance. One bride weakened rapidly after the wedding, her decline attributed to a mysterious sickness that no physician could cure. Another was accused of impropriety and sent to a convent so remote that letters stopped coming, while another vanished entirely, her absence explained only by a brief announcement that she had offended God and the Tsar. Each time, the court adjusted, absorbed the loss, and moved on, because survival depended on forgetting quickly and remembering selectively. For the women who watched from the margins, ladies in waiting, distant relatives, daughters of nobles waiting to be summoned for the next bride show, the lesson was unmistakable and terrifying. Marriage to the Tsar was not a bond, but a trial without an acquittal, and proximity to power was not a shield, but an accelerant. They learned to monitor their expressions, to speak carefully, to pray not for favor, but for invisibility, because being noticed was the first step toward being tested, and tests were designed to be failed. Even pregnancy offered no safety, because children could be taken, doubts could be raised, and love itself could be reframed as manipulation. As Marfa lay confined and watched, her fate began to merge with those who came before her, her individuality dissolving into a category the system understood well: the bride who did not last. Above ground, officials rehearsed explanations. Whispers of witchcraft circulated with convenient vagueness, and lists were quietly updated, because every ending required culprits, and culprits required preparation. Families connected to her lineage felt the temperature change around them. Invitations withdrawn, conversations shortened, glances sharpened, because association itself could be reinterpreted as complicity once the narrative hardened. What made the pattern so effective was that it spread fear without demanding constant action from the Tsar himself. The expectation of an ending did the work, disciplining behavior, silencing questions, and encouraging self-censorship, while Ivan remained the distant center, consulted, informed, and deferred to, but rarely contradicted. The brides became symbols rather than people, warnings wrapped in silk and ceremony, their stories stripped of detail until only the lesson remained. As Marfa's name joined this grim lineage, the court prepared to absorb her disappearance with practiced efficiency, converting grief into caution and caution into obedience. The machine did not pause for mourning, because mourning suggested attachment, and attachment was dangerous. Somewhere in the shadows, the next selection was already being imagined, another young woman, measured and weighed by the same criteria, unaware that history had already written her ending in advance, and that the cycle would continue, polished by ritual and justified by fear, until no one could remember a bride who truly survived. The death that became evidence. When Marfa finally slipped beyond recovery, her death did not close a chapter, but opened a case, because in Ivan, the terrible's world, death was never an ending. It was a resource to be mined for meaning, leverage, and permission. The announcement was crafted with care, stripped of uncertainty, and saturated with implication, declaring that the young Tsarina had been struck down by hidden enemies using forbidden arts, a phrasing that transformed grief into accusation and suspicion into duty. No proof was required, because the story itself created its own gravity, pulling names, families, and fortunes into its orbit. And once spoken aloud by authority, the narrative hardened into truth. Courtiers understood immediately what this meant, because they had seen it before, in smaller forms, how illness could become witchcraft, how coincidence could be sharpened into conspiracy, and how proximity to a victim could be reinterpreted as participation in her fate. Investigations were announced with solemn vows to protect the realm, but the outcomes were known in advance. Arrests would be made, confessions extracted, punishments displayed, not to uncover what had happened, but to demonstrate that something had been done. The appearance of justice mattered more than accuracy, because accuracy might raise questions, and questions were the one thing the system could not tolerate. Families linked to Marfa's lineage were summoned and interrogated. Servants vanished into cells beneath the city, and rumors multiplied, each one feeding the next, until fear itself became evidence, cited as proof that guilt was present, even if it could not yet be named. Under torture, words spilled that satisfied expectations rather than reality, because the goal was not truth but coherence, a story that aligned with the Tsar's certainty that betrayal surrounded him. Each confession justified the next arrest. Each arrest validated the original claim, and the machinery gained momentum, converting a single death into a cascade of terror. What made this process so effective was its moral framing, because it presented violence as defense and cruelty as vigilance, allowing participants to see themselves not as perpetrators, but as guardians. Officials who signed orders told themselves they were preventing chaos. Soldiers who carried out sentences believed they were preserving order. And priests who offered blessings reassured themselves that obedience served God's will as interpreted by the sovereign. In this way, responsibility dissolved, spread thin across many hands until no one felt fully accountable, even as the consequences grew catastrophic. Marfa's body was barely cold when the consequences rippled outward, reshaping the court and the countryside alike. Executions were staged as warnings, property seized as precaution, and silence enforced as loyalty, while the original question of her sickness faded into irrelevance, replaced by the certainty that enemies had been found and punished. The system did not require her to have been poisoned by others, only that her death could be used to reinforce the belief that enemies were everywhere, because a ruler who could convince his realm that danger was constant could justify any measure taken in the name of survival. In the end, Marfa became less a person than a symbol, her life compressed into a lesson that obedience was fragile and favor temporary, and that even the highest position offered no protection from suspicion. Her death, officially mourned and privately instrumentalized, provided the spark for another wave of terror that would claim countless lives, all linked by a chain of logic that began not with proof, but with fear. And as the court adjusted once more to a world narrowed by caution, the true purpose of her suffering became clear, not to reveal a conspiracy, but to renew a system that fed on accusation and sustained itself through the constant creation of enemies. What history tried to bury, when the echoes of punishment faded and the court settled into its familiar hush, the machinery that had consumed Marfa turned its attention outward, polishing the official record until it reflected stability rather than horror, because empires do not survive by admitting what they are willing to do to maintain control. Chroniclers wrote of illness, of unfortunate weakness, of divine mystery, while omitting the chambers that did not exist and the rituals that could not be acknowledged. And in doing so, they performed the final service demanded by even the terrible system, transforming lived suffering into abstraction. The truth did not vanish, but it fragmented, surviving in letters smuggled abroad, in diplomatic reports written by uneasy witnesses, in rumors whispered by servants who understood that memory itself could be dangerous. What emerges when these fragments are gathered is not the portrait of a singularly monstrous man acting on impulse, but a portrait of power structured to erase resistance by absorbing intimacy. A system that understood women not as partners or people, but as instruments through which loyalty could be tested and fear renewed. The brides were not chosen for compatibility or affection. They were chosen because their bodies and positions made them perfect conduits for control, visible enough to send a message and vulnerable enough to be sacrificed without destabilizing the throne. Each marriage rehearsed the same lesson for the realm, that closeness to authority magnified risk, that survival depended on obedience, and that innocence offered no defense against suspicion. Modern historians who have re-examined court records and forensic evidence have begun to speak more plainly about what earlier generations softened or ignored, noting patterns that align too neatly to be dismissed as coincidence. Slow poisoning disguised as illness, psychological isolation framed as piety, confinement justified as protection, and public accusations designed not to discover truth, but to generate compliance. These techniques appear again and again, not only in Ivan's Russia, but in other regimes where unchecked power sought permanence. The difference lies not in the methods themselves, but in how successfully they were concealed beneath ritual and language that framed violence as necessity. The final injustice done to Marfa and the women like her was not only their suffering, but the way that suffering was repurposed to teach the wrong lesson, encouraging later generations to focus on the spectacle of cruelty rather than the structure that enabled it. To reduce these stories to the madness of one ruler is comforting because it suggests that horror requires exceptional pathology, but the record suggests something far more unsettling, that ordinary institutions, when aligned with absolute authority and insulated from accountability, can normalize acts that would otherwise be unthinkable. As the years passed and Ivan's reign drew toward its end, the system he refined continued to cast a long shadow, shaping how power was exercised and how dissent was understood, leaving behind a legacy that could be felt long after specific names faded from memory. The brides became footnotes, their lives summarized in a line or two, while the machinery that consumed them remained largely intact, ready to be inherited, adapted, and reused. In reflecting on their stories, now the darkness lies not only in what was done, but in how easily it was justified, recorded, and forgotten. A reminder that history's most disturbing chapters are often those written carefully in measured language to ensure that the true cost of power remains just out of sight.